Some trees you plant for yourself, you'll pick fruit from them within a few years, maybe even in the first season. But there's a different category of tree, one that asks for something rarer than water or good soil. It asks for patience that outlasts a single lifetime. Plant these, and there's a real chance you won't be the one who benefits most. Your children might get a modest harvest. Your grandchildren might be the ones who finally see what the tree was capable of all along. That's not a flaw. For the families who've done this for generations, it's the entire point. Here are 10 trees worth planting with someone else's future in mind, and stick around for number 3 because it might be the slowest, strangest one on this list and also the most meaningful. 1. Olive trees. Few trees on earth blur the line between a lifetime and a legacy quite like the olive. Depending on the variety and how it's propagated, an olive tree typically produces its first usable fruit somewhere between 3 and 8 years after planting, which sounds reasonably fast. But that's only the beginning of the story. Full stable production generally doesn't arrive until the tree is 30 to 70 years old, and many productive olive groves are only just reaching their prime by the time the person who planted them has passed the land on to the next generation. Traditionally, in Mediterranean farming families, olive groves have been handed down from parent to child for exactly this reason, not because the first generation didn't benefit, but because the real payoff kept building for decades after. Individual olive trees have been documented living for many centuries, with some of the oldest specimens in the world estimated at well over 1,000 years old, still producing fruit today. When you plant an olive tree, you're not really planting food for this year, you're planting a slow motion inheritance. 2. Sugar maple. In parts of the northeastern United States and Canada, families don't just inherit land, they inherit a sugar bush, a stand of mature sugar maples tapped every late winter for sap that gets boiled down into syrup. A sugar maple needs to reach roughly 30 to 40 years of age and a trunk diameter of at least 10 to 12 inches before it can be tapped sustainably without harming the tree. Once a maple reaches that size, though, it can continue producing sap for generations, sometimes over a century, with the same tree tapped by grandparents, then grandchildren, all from the same trunk. Sugar maples themselves can live up to around 400 years under good conditions, some of the longest lifespans of any common temperate tree. Plant one today, and it's genuinely likely that you'll never tap it yourself in any meaningful way. Your grandchildren might be the ones setting up buckets under a tree that's finally ready. 3. Pinyon pine. This is the tree I mentioned at the start, and it might be the most extreme example of delayed reward in this entire list. Native to the American Southwest, pinyon pines produce pine nuts, but they do so on a timeline that makes most fruit trees look almost instant by comparison. A pinyon pine typically needs at least 10 to 15 years before it produces its first cones at all, and meaningful harvestable production generally doesn't begin until the tree is somewhere between 75 and 100 years old. On top of that, pinyon pines are what's called a masting species, meaning they produce a genuinely large crop only once every several years, sometimes as infrequently as once a decade, with smaller or non-existent harvests in between. Individual pinyon pines can live for centuries, with some documented specimens estimated at 350 years old or more. If you plant a pinyon pine today, there's a real chance that you, your children, and possibly even your grandchildren will never see it at true full production. It's less a garden tree and more a promise made to a great-grandchild you'll never meet. 4. Pecan trees. Pecans are a genuine long game. Depending on the variety and how it was propagated, a pecan tree typically takes somewhere between 7 and 10 years before it produces a meaningful nut crop, and full reliable production often isn't reached until the tree is well into its second or third decade. Once established in the right climate, though, a mature pecan tree can remain productive for many decades, in some cases beyond a century, continuing to bear a substantial annual harvest with reasonable care. Native to parts of North America, pecans have a long history of being planted specifically as a generational asset, valued as much for the shade and timber they eventually provide as for the nuts themselves. A pecan planted by a grandparent today is realistically a tree the grandchildren will be the ones harvesting at scale. 5. English walnut. Walnut trees ask for a similar kind of patience. Most varieties take somewhere between 6 and 10 years to begin producing nuts, but a young walnut tree's yield is modest at best. It typically takes 15 to 20 years, sometimes longer, before a tree reaches anything close to its full nut-bearing potential. What makes walnut especially suited to a generational mindset is that the tree offers two separate long term payoffs. There's the annual nut harvest, which builds gradually over decades, and there's the wood itself, since mature walnut timber is genuinely valuable for furniture and woodworking, but only after many decades of steady growth. A walnut planted today is realistically a food source for your children and a timber asset for whoever inherits the land after that. 6. Chestnut trees. Historically valued as a bread tree across parts of Europe and Asia because of their dense, carbohydrate rich nuts, chestnuts also reward long term thinking. Depending on the variety, a chestnut tree generally begins producing within about 5 to 7 years, but it can take considerably longer, sometimes 15 years or more, to reach strong, consistent yields. It's worth being clear about one serious risk here. Chestnut blight devastated American chestnut populations during the 20th century, and it remains a real threat in many regions today, so anyone planning to plant chestnuts for future generations should specifically research blight-resistant hybrid varieties suited to their climate, rather than assuming any chestnut will hold up over a multi-decade timeline. Planted carefully, though, a healthy chestnut tree can remain productive for well over a century, quietly feeding a family long after the original planter is gone. 7. Black walnut. Different from the English walnut in flavor and use, black walnut is native to eastern North America and has long been planted with future generations explicitly in mind, mostly for its timber. Black walnut wood is among the most valuable hardwoods in North America, but a tree needs decades, often 40 years or more, to reach a size and quality worth harvesting for lumber. In the meantime, the tree does produce edible nuts, typically starting around 4 to 6 years after planting, with production increasing gradually over the following decades. Many landowners plant black walnut fully understanding that the real financial and material payoff belongs to whoever owns the land 2 or 3 generations later, treating the tree less like a crop and more like a long-term investment left in the ground. 8. American beech. Beech trees aren't typically planted for their nuts commercially, but they've quietly fed people and wildlife for a very long time, and they represent one of the slowest, longest lived trees on this list. A beech tree can take 40 years or more before producing a significant nut crop called mast, and even then, like the pinyon pine, beeches are masting species that produce heavily only in certain years. What makes beech remarkable is longevity. These trees commonly live 200 to 300 years, with some specimens surviving considerably longer, meaning a single beech planted today could realistically still be standing and still producing for a family 5 or 6 generations removed from the person who planted it. 9. English oak. Oaks are rarely planted for their acorns as a primary food source today, but historically, acorn flour was a genuine part of the diet in a number of cultures, and English oak in particular has long symbolized exactly this kind of multi-generational planting. An oak typically doesn't produce a significant acorn crop until it's at least 20 to 50 years old, and like other masting species, its harvests vary considerably from year to year. Where oak truly stands apart is lifespan. English oaks commonly live several centuries, with some documented specimens in Europe estimated at over 1,000 years old. There's an old saying among foresters that applies directly here. You don't plant an oak for yourself, you plant it for your grandchildren and often quite literally for their grandchildren too. 10. Date palm. In parts of the Middle East and North Africa, date palms have been planted as multi-generational assets for thousands of years, and the timeline explains why. A date palm typically begins producing fruit around 4 to 8 years after planting, but it usually takes closer to 10 to 15 years to reach strong, reliable production, and full maturity can take even longer depending on the variety and growing conditions. Once established, though, a healthy date palm can remain productive for 60 years or more, in some cases considerably longer, continuing to bear substantial annual harvests with relatively modest ongoing care. Because of this timeline, planting date palms has traditionally been treated as an act of long-term family investment, with groves passed down and expanded across generations rather than planted and harvested within a single lifetime. None of these trees are a quick win, and that's really the point of this list. Every one of them asks you to accept that the biggest reward might land on someone else's plate decades after you did the work of planting, watering, and protecting a young tree through its slowest, most vulnerable years. That's a harder sell in a world built around instant results, but it's also exactly why these trees carry a different kind of meaning. A fruit tree you harvest next year is groceries. A tree your grandchildren harvest from wood you planted with their future in mind is something closer to a gift across time. If even one of these fits your climate and your land, it might be worth planting this season, not for what it gives you, but for who it's eventually going to feed. Which one would you plant for the next generation? Let us know in the comments.